Hello, everyone. I'm Christian Oppie, professor of history at UMass Amherst and director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. Welcome to tonight's panel commemorating the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq by exploring the Iraqi experience of the conflict. We are broadcasting from the campus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pocumtuck Nation on the land of the Norwottuck community. We begin with that acknowledgement. This event is presented by the UMass Amherst History Department's Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series on Confronting US Imperialism. I encourage you to visit the Feinberg Series website to learn more. View recordings of prior events and register for our capstone event on April 3rd. An evening of poetry with 5 distinguished poets whose work has been profoundly influenced by US imperialism in Vietnam and Iraq and the Americas. You can find more information about these offerings in the chatter box, along with information on how to turn on live closed captioning and how to listen to tonight's event in Spanish. If you are attending this event as part of a class, you'll also want to look to the chat box for a link to our sign-in sheet. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the more than 36 university and community partners who collaborated with the History Department to co-present this series. I also thank the large team of students, faculty, and staff whose collaborative efforts brought this series to fruition. Kenneth R. Feinberg and Associates, whose generosity makes this series possible, and Daniel Ellsberg, whose actions more than 50 years ago and ever since have inspired this series and the work we'll be doing going forward here at UMass through the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. After the presentations, we are looking forward to a lively Q&A session. We will periodically drop a link to the Q&A form into the chat box. As you listen to the presentations, please use the form to submit your question when you think of it. No need to wait until the end to submit. We will assemble the questions backstage as we prepare for the Q&A. It is now my honor to introduce our moderator, the historian and public intellectual, Ross Caputi. Ross is co-author of The Sacking of Fallujah, A People's History, director of the film Fear Not, The Path of Truth, based on his own military experience in Iraq, and co-founder and director of archives at Archive Iraq, and a member of our Feinberg Series committee. Ross.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us to hear from these distinguished speakers and to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq. Over the past couple weeks, Iraq has reemerged in the media after years of silence. The anniversary is being presented as a somber occasion to remember, but looking back on Iraq, what exactly have we been remembering? Retrospective takes on the costs and consequences of this conflict, almost exclusively from an American perspective, have popped up all over our news feeds. Nearly every major news network has run at least something on the experiences of American soldiers in Iraq and the psychological burdens they still bear. To the extent that we've heard Iraqi stories, they usually get filtered through American stories. American journalists will quote Iraqis to add depth to their coverage, but it would require a deep dive into the internet to find unprompted, unfiltered accounts from Iraqis. This sort of content doesn't get promoted by large media networks. It doesn't trend on social media. One phrase that has never come up in the mainstream remembrances of the invasion is war crime. Our invasion of Iraq was exactly that, a war crime. By invading Iraq without a UN Security Council resolution, we committed the crime of aggression. And then in the course of the occupation, we committed numerous others. I'm assuming that this is news for a lot of you, and maybe you'll be surprised to learn that the remembrances that have been circulating over the last few weeks have mostly reproduced propaganda. And when I say propaganda, I don't mean flattering official depictions of what our military did in Iraq, though there's certainly been plenty of that. But I mean self-conscious propaganda from government and military officials peddling falsehoods disguised as news. This was how most of us learned about Iraq. Events were strategically narrated to us from US military spokespersons during press conferences. Intelligence was cherry-picked and leaked to journalists to paint a distorted picture of facts on the ground. The experience of soldiers were intentionally highlighted and presented to the American public as a sort of ground truth, while Iraqi voices were deliberately marginalized. The stories we heard about Iraq were almost exclusively the stories our military wanted us to hear, and they used the media, to use their lingo, as a force multiplier to disseminate propaganda to a mass audience. Even the stories that veterans brought back with them from Iraq did more to mislead than to inform. In the eyes of most Americans, soldiers are probably the most trusted source of information about the wars we fight. They were on the front lines, so most assume no one would know better than them. But I promise you, as a former Marine infantryman who was in Iraq in 2004, there is nothing insightful about combat. Nothing about this experience gives you special wisdom about war. It's an incredibly compartmentalized experience with no special access to intelligence or information. Most of the time, we didn't really know who was shooting at us or why, but we had all kinds of assumptions about the so-called insurgents that we gleaned from our primary source of information, the news playing on the televisions in the chow halls. We were misinformed by the same news as Americans back home, and it was that, more than anything else, that shaped our beliefs about why these people were shooting at us and why we needed to shoot back. The slogan of our mission in Iraq was winning hearts and minds. And most of you likely assumed that meant Iraqi hearts and minds, and we would win them by helping Iraqis build a democracy, by providing security and happy stuff like that. But in reality, our military was equally concerned about both Iraqi and American hearts and minds. And to the US military, this constituted a military objective to be achieved primarily through what the military calls information operations. It's a militarized form of propaganda. Information operations shaped the stories that shaped Americans' perceptions about our invasion and occupation of Iraq. And over the past few weeks, it has been these same propagandistic narratives that have been circulated as a kind of commemoration. The theme of this year's Feinberg series has been Confronting Imperialism. And the title of this event, Resisting Imperial Memory, was intended to suggest that our memory of Iraq is in some way connected to American imperialism. If the connection isn't obvious to you, it is to American military strategists. The militarization of propaganda came with a shift in thinking about the strategic value of what they call soft power in combat operations. The idea is to persuade foreign and domestic populations to accept rather than resist American power. But it also persuaded our society to get on board with a war without giving us a fair chance to make up our own minds and to come to an informed position on our diplomatic relations with Iraq. Our political leaders made the decision for us and then manipulated the case for war to build support for a predetermined policy. But tonight, we have 4 speakers who will present on topics that, for one reason or another, have been left out of the public debate on Iraq. Our panelists will speak on a range of issues from the lived experiences of Iraqis under occupation, the theft and plunder of Iraq's cultural heritage, to the destruction that the occupation wreaked on Iraq's environment, and the illegality of our invasion and its consequences for the international rule of law. So I won't take any more time from you or from our speakers. Let me introduce our first presenter. Salman Khairalla is an Iraqi environmental and human rights activist and a co-founder and CEO of Humat Dijla. Salman, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Rose. Thank you for all the introduction and everything you present. Thank you, Christian, and thanks for all the people who's listening to us. Thanks to the people who is listening in Iraq, which is very late in Iraqi time now. It is 11 p.m. in the night in Iraqi time. Thank you so much for the listening. Yeah, March 2003. It was something really different. It's a story that we will tell all the people about it and what's going on. It's suddenly in the night, my dad, he told my mom that tomorrow we should go to the market to buy some stuff. I don't know why, but I went with them to the market. Sorry, this time they is not as usual. They buy a lot of stuff, and I asked why. They said, Salman, don't speak. Let's buy the stuff and back home quickly. And as soon as we arrive home, I saw there is another 3 families. They join us in our house. So it was my uncles, 2 of my uncles. They were with us in the same house. I don't know what's going on. My dad and my uncles, they didn't tell us what's going on till the night is coming. And when we saw them, they put sellotape above the glasses and windows just to protect it if something will happen. And they said, that's it. We were listening to Monte Carlo, and on Monte Carlo, they said the attack in the plane, it's a flight from UK, and we start counting the 6 hours to listen to the shaking of the windows. Still the shaking of the windows in our mind. This is what happened for all the Iraqis in my childhood, and all the people, they still remember those times. The invasion of Iraq actually had very bad recording on all the life about Iraq. Even if we will say, like, the advantage of that was to get off of Saddam Hussein. I know Saddam Hussein was bad, and we still know Saddam Hussein is bad. But what's happened after Saddam Hussein, it might be, for me, as because I live with them, it was maybe worse than Saddam Hussein and what's going on. And all of that, it's because of the invasion and the new government and the new system that they bring it to Iraq in a shock way, which is they just like electricity, you bring electricity directly to the people. This is what's happened to the Iraqis after 2003. And all this reflect on many other topics, reflect on our economic start to collapse, reflect on environment, and our environment start to collapse already, and reflect on all the daily life of the people in Iraq. If I want to start what's going on after 2003. What's going on after 2003? All the terrorists is coming. The sectarian war between Sunni and Shia is coming. After that, terrorist is coming. After Al-Qaeda is Daesh is coming. After Daesh, we don't know what's going on in Iraq, and the militias start to control everything. So that's what happened very briefly, basically in the last 20 years, which is we didn't see any green or good light in this life. The 20 years spent from our life with always stressed. We always calling our friends when they are late because we don't know what's going on, even if there is no Saddam, but there is militia, and there is this system that's American and English people, they bring it to us. So how the invasion reflect on the environment itself and what's going on about the Iraqi environment. If you don't know about Iraqi environment, the Iraqi environment actually it's really weird. It's really bad in the level of that it's need a lot of work. If you want to talk about water issues, our water system is really basic water system. If you want to talk about pollution, we still sending the contaminated, polluted sewage water directly to the river. In 2018, there is more than 6,000 population, they get poisoned because of the pollution in Basra, and that was the first sign of the demonstration in that time in 2018. And all this reflect on our environmental section in Iraq. The environmental and water system in Iraq during Saddam regime was bad also, but was on the edge of the hell, big hell. We don't know what's going on. And from 2003 till now, it's never the Iraqi government, they never put the environment and water as a priority for their work, what to do and what they should do exactly against that, and what they should do for the water issues. Right now, or yesterday, in 22nd of March, it was the International Day of Water. And Iraq sent a big delegation to the New York to attend the United Nations International Day of Water. And in the same time, they left Iraqis and a lot of people in south part of Iraq, they don't have even enough water to drink. We don't have negotiation to get our right of our water. All this happened because of the invasion. Yes, the invasion, it's really affecting all the people. Still, there is people suffering from the diseases it's get because of the weapons that was using during that time. And also, still, we lost a lot of our archaeological antiquities, and we still miss them because of the invasion, and they have stolen them during the invasion. All that's happened to Iraq in this 20 year and more till 2019. In 2019, the Iraqi uprising, this is what I call it, which is the October protests. What's happened in Iraq, it was something really new and never we thought about it. Even when we as a human rights defenders, I work a lot for the awarenessing, but I didn't reach the point or believing that there is that much of Iraqis will be in the street. And in 2019, what's happened in the street, it's the dot of the sentence, an end of the sentence, to tell all around the world that the Iraqis, they still need to live as a human being around all this world. The awareness and what the youth think about and how they start aware each other about the new situation and what they should do is starting from that time. That's why the last 2 or 3 years from 2019 till now, it was more unstable. Now, but unfortunately, what we should say, it is like in 2019, what's happened, we lost all the supporting from the international community. And this is one of the points that we can say as an Iraqi, it's a shame on the international agencies and community who is left all the people killed in the street and no one talk about them. There is thousands of people injured because of this protest and no one talk to the government. And now a lot of those government, all of them, they come to support the same Iraqi government who was killing the people in the street. All that's happened because of the Iraqi invasion. The invasion, did I get all my time, Rose, or do I have more?
Go ahead, Salman.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just want to mention that. Actually the bad record of the Iraqi invasion and the imperialism of American and what they bring to Iraq. It's not only from 2003, actually. No, it is even from 90s when they sent the attack plane in 1991 after the Kuwait war with Iraq. It's starting from that time when they start to make the siege and closing all the resources for the Iraqis, and the boycotting was not for Saddam family or Saddam himself, was for the Iraqi local community. They don't find the food. They didn't get the food. They didn't get the bread. They didn't get anything in that time. And after, in 2003, they came to invade, to do the invasion and occupied Iraq again and destroying all what we have. And it was the last moment that we have it in that time. Thank you, Rose.
That was jarring to hear, but I think we needed to hear it. Thank you, Salman. So let me introduce our next speaker. Professor Rubaii is an anthropologist at Purdue University. She is a co-founder of Archive Iraq and an expert on militarism and counterinsurgency in Iraq. Thank you, Callie.
Thank you, Ross, and to everyone for organizing this event with some of the scholars and activists I most respect, especially in this moment of deep ethical exhaustion. So what I want to show today by highlighting a few examples of environmental health harms that are triggered by the US invasion is that the devastation of Iraq's environment is exemplary rather than exceptional. And what I mean by this is that the practice of US imperialism in Iraq is repeated elsewhere too. And there's really no end in sight, because war, as opposed to an invasion or an occupation or a coup, is not an event. It's a structure that's designed to endure. So what we need to be asking ourselves in the US is if this is the 20th anniversary of the most recent violation of Iraq by the US, and the 50th anniversary since the first invasion and then sanctions, not to mention earlier support that the US had for Saddam Hussein, then what do we want US-Iraq relations to look like over the next 20 or 50 years? And I want us to confront US imperialism with a really clear-eyed acknowledgement that our entire economy is geared towards perpetual warfare. And that has cost and continues to cost hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, and then continues to have rippling lethal effects all over the world and across many generations. This was a war for profit. From an environmental perspective, what matters there is that it dramatically increased the sheer tonnage of munitions and military waste. So those flat screen TVs that made forward operating bases more comfortable for military personnel ended up making the air more toxic when they got burned, and corporations continue to profit from the massive consumption and destruction that these wars have caused. Many of us have retirement funds that are investing in these corporations, which highlights our complicity, but also how empire redistributes moral burdens. The long-term environmental health effects of US battles, but also then US imposed policies, some of which Salman mentioned, are now evident on the landscape of Iraq. So I'm just going to share my host disabled screen sharing. I would love to share my screen as a background if it's an option. Many Americans have now heard about burn pits. And of course, there were huge amounts of waste, uniforms, tanks, all of this material doused in jet fuel and burned on American bases in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 years in total. Let's see if I can share now. Sorry, everyone. It'll just take me 1 second. Okay. So US soldiers and contractors lobbied for support and financial compensation for the toxic exposure that they suffered during the occupation. They, of course, experienced acute short-term exposure in the prime of their lives. Now they have cancer and respiratory illnesses, and some have died. But meanwhile, Iraqi communities downwind face long-term diffuse exposure from cradle to grave. And a lot of those families face much more than health harms. So today, burn pits look like the form of a scar on the landscape. During my last trip to Iraq, about 3 weeks ago now, I met with a family that was growing grass crops. They were sort of raising their crops and trying something new to feed livestock. Their land was just a few miles downwind of where a burn pit used to be. And they spent many years with smoke as the backdrop of their lives. Khalid, which is a pseudonym, was an 18-year-old newlywed during the US invasion. And she ended up having 2 healthy children, but then suffered a series of miscarriages and stillbirths that she attributes to the burn pit. And then her husband, Abu Khalid, remembers being dizzy and seeing blurry air that smelled like gas when he was trying to do farm work during various periods of US military activity. Now they're in their 40s and they've had to change their farming practices because nothing will thrive on the land, even years after the burn pit has closed. And Abu Khalid himself was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, but in spite of all these health crises, his main concern remains economic, which is the value of his land has been driven down by the burn pit's legacy. And he said he'd like to move, but who would ever buy his land? And he says, we're stuck here. So when we talk about something like burn pits, the thing that makes them military grade toxic are the kinds of materials that go into them. And those materials cause violence, not just here, but all along the chain of supply. We know the materials that end up in burn pits came from a lot of other places that are also ravaged by violence. And so in asking, where do these predominantly war metals is what I've been following, where do these metals come from? I visited the DRC last year, and this is what the landscape looks like there. This is where many of the minerals that are used in contemporary warfare are being mined. And I learned how the miners there are facing premature death by mine shaft collapse and oxygen deprivation and just basic injuries. But of course, they're also facing the same cancers and reproductive health problems that we're seeing in Iraq. This is an entirely underregulated system. Work is artisanal, which means no one's employed by an individual. And by the way, this is a national park. This is a nature preserve. And the minerals then are sold through a network of brokers. So by the time a company like Raytheon buys coltan or uranium or whatever metal they want, it's nearly impossible to trace it back to the mine that it was extracted from. War is becoming increasingly electronic. Sorry, I didn't mean to show you that yet. So think of drone centers, the high-tech navigation systems, but also those entertainment systems and electronic pleasures that were accessible on military bases. All of that means more minerals are implicated in the project of war. And it also means that the electronic devices that we're using are going to end up in a burn pit of sorts, maybe not a military one. The materials that are mined then end up traveling all across the globe because of the enterprise that warfare makes. And James Smith just published a book called In the Eyes of the World, which is a great documentation of this. So in a way, burn pits in Iraq are like a receipt. They give clues to the toxic tally of war by aggregating all of the material evidence about war as a transnational economic structure. And then they implicate all of the people and institutions along that chain of supply. So they demonstrate how US-Iraq relationship is a toxic one that incorporates a lot of other players, and the US and its capital exploits across the global South and North America are part and parcel of this project. I'm just going to briefly show you this other picture. This is a burn pit in Colfax, Louisiana, which was the site of the Colfax massacre and continues to be the site of systemic racism. It's a majority Black community that's facing toxicity because the Colfax burn pit uses it uses diesel fuel to burn undetonated munitions that were coming from Camp Menin and other military locations. And families living there have skin rashes and hair loss, a lot of health problems, but they also have to listen to the sound of war as all these munitions are exploded. Sometimes they're big enough to shake houses off their foundation. I don't think it's a coincidence then that there's also a commemorative plaque that honors white supremacists who participated in the Colfax massacre and acknowledges that they died in defense of white supremacy. So once again, we can add a tally of bodies, not just from Africa, but even on the US, that become complicit in the economic webs that then end up lighting Iraq on fire. So following the minerals and materials that do not go back into burn pits, we can also see the policy legacy of privatization in Iraq today. So when the US formally shifted power to the CPA, it issued these 100 orders that are kind of well known, but they basically systematically privatized every sector of Iraq's economy, and that gutted public resources over the long haul. So the backstory of what I'm about to tell you about how war metals travel inside Iraq is that this is a picture of Fallujah this year. I just took this picture a few weeks ago. Fallujah City has a brand new shopping mall, brand new construction in the center of town, a lot of quick aesthetic building. And the rich are enjoying an improvement in quality of life. Meanwhile, just off the main road, this is how people are living. And the reality is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. The roads are so pocked here that the cars can't really drive on them. There's trash everywhere. It looks to me a bit like an old missile crater. And there are minimal public resources. So what that means is from construction to medical care, banking to oil extraction, everything was privatized and there's nothing left for the public sector. So in Anbar province, at least, people are having to use personal air filters, personal water filters, and they're burning diesel generators for personal electricity because the public sector was never destroyed after the US invasion. And that's not by coincidence, it was by design. So the question is, what happens to things like this car carcass? Based on the exposure histories that I took during my research, it's evident that the most dangerous thing that a family can do is return home after military battles. And it's construction workers, especially, who have a financial incentive to return first after battle periods, and they do the cleaning and demolishing and rebuilding of bombed buildings. And they're doing the dirty work of cleaning up from these wars. They're also experiencing a higher rate of health issues. So today, people are gathering scrap metal like you saw, and some of it has been left since the 90s, and they're trucking it up north to parts of Iraq where they can make about $60 per ton of scrap metal, which is not a lot of money. Bazian Valley is an example of a place where this is happening. This is in Iraqi Kurdistan. It's a place with Iraq's largest underground aquifer. It's where farmers are growing food and they're really struggling. Sometimes they spend hours wiping dust and oil off of their tree leaves, and their livestock and horses, as you can see here, are stressed from constant factory noise. And it's clear from breathing the air here, and you can see that there's minimal, if any, environmental regulation taking place. The sound of war is also echoing here because dynamite is used to explode and break up the limestone hills for the cement industry. And meanwhile, this valley hosts the twin steel industry that's about rebar production. So basically, this is what war scrap metal recycling looks like. Munitions, shredded cars, they're all melted down into rebar. And that process includes a preference for heavy metals, which means the more toxic the metal, the stronger the metal. So there's an incentive to melt down and metabolize missile shells and tank parts. And every now and then, a factory has been known to explode because of the undetonated weapons that go into these fires. You can see in the middle picture light streaming in from the ceiling of this of this steel manufacturing plant, which is where unexploded ordnances popped during the fire. It's extremely dangerous work. Part of the coerced privatization of Iraq includes extractive labor laws. So all of the workers here are from a rural community in India. Locals are not hired because they cost more, and there's more accountability for laborers who are also citizens. Even though people who are working on this land, because their land has been destroyed, they would like jobs, the factories prefer not to hire them. And in the cement factories, it's mostly workers from China. By the time they're too sick to work, they get sent home and there's no accountability. So in the story of Iraq now, we have to also add bodies from the DRC, North America, China, and India to the list of people who are exposed to these toxic elements. So in conclusion, I've taken you from burn pits to mineral mines to post-war recycling, and I'm trying to show how the US imperialism that we're talking about. This is a picture of Salman and me doing soil samples in Bazian Valley. Trying to show how the accountability that we're going to be talking about over the next 20 years needs to include these corporate enterprises, and how US foreign policy is heavily influenced by these economic structures and the military-industrial complex that underpins the kind of weapons that we're seeing distributed over and over again across Iraq's landscape. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was incredible. Thank you, Callie. So our next speaker is Nazli Tarzi. She's a political analyst and widely published writer focused on state-society relations, security, extremism, civil disobedience, everyday life, and water insecurity in Iraq and the Middle East. She is also a co-founder of Archive Iraq. Nazli, thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here, especially alongside colleagues and comrades and friends whose work I've been reading with great interest. My talk for today tackles a quartet of themes: loss and memory, material culture and personhood. So the past decade has witnessed great scholarship about the way in which the political convulsions that Iraq have witnessed have shaped and reshaped the media landscape and the media system. Few have examined the way in which the reconstitution of the media sector was contingent on the eradication of what came before it. I've chosen to focus on a singular historical event which captures this missing sort of history, if you like, and it's also to push back against willful amnesia. So the title of it is Iraq's Prolonged Humpty Dilemma, and by that I do mean Humpty Dumpty and the Lost TV Archive. In the initial weeks of the Anglo-American invasion, looting on a gargantuan scale engulfed Iraq. Organized mobs, lone wolves, and arsonists tore through political and cultural institutions, helping themselves to national treasures as American troops stood idly by. In this free-for-all environment, which no police force could contain after the disbanding of Iraq's security apparatus, nothing was immune. Hysteria eclipsed any imaginable sense of calm as well as order. What about the fallout? The greatest casualty of all was Iraqi personhood. Imagine that the contents of your personal hard drive, which stretches as far back as your childhood, is expunged, unable to be restored. This is the story of Iraq's TV archive, a story of colossal theft, deletion, and disfiguration by thieves who were driven by avidity, intent, and supervised by occupying powers. So why does this matter? The question of what or who is deemed a casualty in war is not determined by who gets struck down by enemy fire. Theft as a personal, political, and/or profit-seeking act could help us to broaden our definition of what or who is a casualty, but also to recognize looting as a constitutive part of violent political transitions. History can also be a casualty of war, as can public memory, and most tragically and commonly, human lives. Archives and manuscripts too fall prey to political violence. In many ways, theft by the Iraqis themselves mirrored that of their occupiers. At the time, mob violence was rationalized by Western journalists and US policymakers as political. Iraqis are righting the wrongs of the past, getting even, they said, looting the looters, headlines read. Despite that, pillagers were not heroized, they were labeled scavengers. They gutted, torched countless ministries, planning, education, irrigation, trade, industry, culture and information, as well as lesser-known government offices. Museums, libraries, hospitals, and archaeological sites, and much more were left unguarded. Only two institutions proved worthy of US protection, the Ministry of Oil and Interior, unsurprisingly. The inordinate volume of intelligence they held would be seized to unlock state secrets and help promulgate US power. America's tabula rasa strategy of wiping the state clean would enable it to refashion Iraq in its own eyes. Needless to say, in the process, edifices of local knowledge came tumbling down. During the days of the Great Loot, Ayyam al-Nahba al-Kubra, Western media personnel jostled for access to government sites, furiously scribbling on sketchpads and observing, mouths agape. The words they eventually published shone the light on unclassified state documents, by that I mean Ba'ath documents, that were spirited out of ministries and in some instances out of the country. The plundering of cultural sites and spaces, in contrast, whether it was theatre houses, galleries, media institutions, was hardly discussed. Global headlines were gripped by the story of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party records. These were, after all, handed to America on a silver plate by members of the Iraqi Memory Foundation, an archive-focused collective fronted by questionable actors, including Mustafa al-Kadhimi, former Iraqi journalist turned prime minister, as well as Kanaan al-Makiyya and Ahmed al-Chalabi. So why does culture matter? These events spawned a heated debate among Iraqis and the Arab press at the time. In this debate, the identity of these audiovisual collections that were plucked out of the TV and radio building in Salahiyya were called into question. Were they Ba'athist, given that the state was the archive's main patron, or were they quintessentially Iraqi, public property produced by homegrown, pioneering broadcasters and cultural giants? A brief history of Iraq's TV archive is required before returning to questions of ownership and personhood. The archive, better known as the TV archive, was the largest collection known in the Middle East. It is as old as Iraq's National Television Corporation, established in 1956. State coverage of the 8-year war with Iran was the most coveted collection it held, as well as items dating back to the monarchical period, including rare photographs. It housed the music archive, as well as theatre productions, television dramas, educational programs, Kurdish content, Turkmen content, literary shows, recordings of diplomatic visits, presidential activity, bilateral talks, historic accords, and of course, self-indulgent celebrations of Saddam Hussein's birthday, which the entire country would be expected to observe. 50 years of history went out in a puff. So who stands to gain? And what are they gaining exactly? Monetary gain isn't the only driving force. Understanding the drivers of looting requires historians and archivists to look beyond the greed thesis. After all, the theft of a national archive is like stealing a passport belonging to a person with different physical identifiers and passing it off as your own. Who then would steal the audiovisual files? What was at stake, and what, if any, were the potential gains? History was at stake. There is little evidence, tangible or otherwise, to corroborate existing theories of the true course of events between 20th of April until the 25th, when looters devoured the TV and radio compound and its adjoining studios, 200, 400, and 600, as they were named. The testimonies I have gathered and studied in my research reinforce the argument that the daylight robbery or grand theft of what these facilities held was premeditated. Sites once brimming with local knowledge were reduced in a 5-day span to sites of amnesia, the second sacking of Baghdad, only this time by American Mongols and their colluders. Together, they tore up Iraq's informational and archival fabric and created a black hole in public memory. Iraqi journalist Haidar Harith al-Najafi describes it as a violation of cultural heritage, and notes that there have been few efforts to unmask the culprits 2 decades on. The consensus is that these TV collections were sold to Arab media houses and satellite stations. Another popular theory is that the American-funded Iraqi television network that would replace what is commonly referred to as the Saddam Media Network was also sold items that looters took. So the looters essentially sold these items back to this new state network that was at the time funded by US occupiers. I recently wrote in the New Arab paper that thieves treated the items like hostages, willing to release them only in exchange for hefty ransoms. So what about the afterlife of these collections? While the whereabouts of the collections that document the days of King Faisal, King Ghazi, Abdul Karim Qasim, Ahmed al-Bakr remain unknown, across social networking sites and streaming platforms, we see that these missing items have acquired digital afterlives. YouTube, and to a lesser extent TikTok and Instagram, are awash with suspicious accounts that have uploaded materials from the TV archive. So what about the prospect of recovery? Does it exist? If examined forensically, these accounts would reveal a digital trail of evidence. If the incumbent government of today's Iraq has demonstrated its ability to repatriate items, stolen items, as was the case with the Iraqi Ba'ath state records, then the retracing and rebuilding of the TV archive is not a fanciful prospect, but something that is quite doable with the support of an amnesty program. This could offer a glimpse of hope that Humpty, 20 years after his great fall, might be one step closer to being put back together again. However, Humpty cannot fix himself without knowledge of where his constitutive parts are. As for my concluding remarks, if and when asked, what does it mean to lose an archive, for me, as both an Iraqi and aspiring anthropologist, it feels like being orphaned, comparable perhaps to long-term memory loss. Perhaps we can unpick this and other questions and themes during our Q&A. Thank you for listening.
Incredible, Nazli. I don't know what to say. So our next speaker is Dave Inder Comar. He's an attorney and the executive director of Just Atonement Incorporated. From 2013 to 2017, he litigated a first-of-its-kind lawsuit on behalf of Iraqi civilian victims of the Iraq War that sought reparations from high-ranking members of the Bush administration. Dave Inder, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers of this event, and thank you for attending. My talk is about the way that the destruction of Iraq goes hand in hand with the destruction of the international rule of law. The attack against Iraq by the United States and its coalition in 2003 was a blatant and reprehensible act of aggression for which there has yet to be any meaningful accountability. At least hundreds of thousands and possibly more than millions of Iraqis have lost their lives through this illegal undertaking. Millions more were displaced. The self-determination of the peoples of Iraq and their ability to choose their own destiny and place in the world was irreparably shattered. Numerous cultural and political elites in the United States gleefully supported the war as a courageous or even joyous act. It was the opposite. The Iraq War constituted an attack on the very concept of the international rule of law. In addition to the injuries inflicted upon Iraqis, 2 decades have now passed since the invasion without any examination of how US conduct has contributed to current international anarchy and aggravated great power violence and confrontation. There has never yet been a reckoning for the Iraq War. The planners and executors of the Iraq War have never faced a formal judicial reckoning, but there should be no doubt that the war was illegal under international law. Under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, all states renounce the use of international violence. Article 51 of the Charter acknowledges self-defense as an exception to the prohibition against the use of force. The UN Charter also permits the UN Security Council to authorize the use of force against a member of the United Nations. The attack against Iraq fell outside of these provisions, constituting illegal aggression. The Iraq inquiry undertaken by the United Kingdom, which released a report in 2016, known as the Chilcot Report, did not opine on the lawfulness of the war. Nevertheless, several submissions made to the Iraq inquiry by international lawyers underscore the illegality of the invasion. Professor Nicholas Grief and others from Kent Law School concluded that without a second Security Council resolution authorizing the invasion of Iraq, quote, the invasion of Iraq constituted an act of aggression, contrary to Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, end quote. Elizabeth Wilmshurst, who was deputy legal advisor to the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and who resigned immediately prior to the invasion, told the Iraq inquiry that I regarded the invasion of Iraq as illegal, and I therefore did not feel able to continue in my post, unquote. These opinions affirm the conclusion that UN Secretary General Kofi Annan himself reached in 2004, when he stated unequivocally, quote, I have indicated it was not in conformity with the UN Charter. From our point of view and from the Charter point of view, it was illegal, end quote. At the Nuremberg trials in 1946, Robert Jackson, a US Supreme Court justice who was named chief prosecutor against defeated Nazi leaders, promised the world that to pass the defendants at Nuremberg a, quote, poison chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. He argued, the common sense of mankind demands that law shall not stop with the punishment of petty crimes by little people. It must also reach men who possess themselves of great power and make deliberate and concerted use of it to set in motion evils which leave no home in the world untouched. The Nuremberg Tribunal agreed with Jackson in convicting high-ranking Nazi leaders for their grave international crimes. The tribunal held, war is essentially an evil thing. Its consequences are not confined to the belligerent states alone, but affect the whole world. To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. The US considers itself an exceptional nation, but what this really means is that it considers itself exceptional to the international rule of law. It is not a mistake that the attack against Iraq in 2003 was falsely linked to the 9/11 terror attacks. The shock of 9/11 provided the cultural and political excuse to destroy the international rule of law as it might apply to the United States. Torture, indefinite detention without trials, and wars of aggression became openly acceptable and even glorified conduct for the United States, smothered in euphemisms like, quote, enhanced interrogation, or prolonged detention, or preventive war. 2 decades have now passed without any examination of how the exemption of the United States from international law has contributed to the Hobbesian state of war in international affairs. 2 decades have passed without any meaningful introspection as to what happened 20 years ago, and whether we, as US Americans, are capable of stopping it from happening again. The United States must engage in a process of national atonement. A formal process of national atonement should be initiated in the United States in order to create cultural reflection, political change, and judicial accountability for the heinous crimes committed against Iraq and the peoples of Iraq. Such a process of national atonement should, among other things, and at the very minimum, ensure that US international relations are conducted in conformity with international law, including the principles of equal rights and self-determination for all peoples, and the general prohibition of aggression, all as outlined in the Friendly Relations Declaration of 1970 and various other international legal instruments. This process of atonement must ensure that US leaders are themselves held accountable by a US court or other neutral legal tribunal for grave international legal violations, including the crime of torture and the crime of aggression. This process of national atonement must ensure that the state of exception from international law that the US has declared for itself must come to an end. And finally, this process of national atonement must ensure that reparations are made to Iraq consistent with principles of international state responsibility for the crime of aggression against Iraq. This process of national atonement should further prompt the United States to work for a genuine international legal order in which all peoples and countries cooperate to maintain a just peace and the international rule of law. This is now an urgent and possibly existential matter, given the planetary threats at hand, including imminent climate collapse, the sixth mass extinction taking place, and the threat of great power violence between nuclear-armed states. Today is an era of sea level rise, rapidly increasing global temperatures, the melting of glaciers, and the spread of dead zones in our shared oceans and global habitats. Our species will simply not survive growing planetary threats this century without a genuine commitment to international cooperation and international law. Justice demands a reckoning for the Iraq War. In addition, our very survival and the survival of our descendants also demands such a reckoning and a true commitment from the US to international law and a just world order. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'd like to open the floor to questions and answers now. So I'd like to begin with a question for all of our speakers. As Americans, we really do want to help, but sometimes our desire to do good can easily be manipulated for military intervention disguised as humanitarian intervention. What can we do now in the aftermath of this conflict to express remorse and stand in solidarity with Iraqis?
I can start. I'm sure people have other more elaborate answers, but part of the counterinsurgency effort that was portrayed as humanitarianism was exactly that, right? It was like provincial reconstruction teams, or the idea that development or green movements, whether militarized or NGOized, were incredibly destructive. But there are incredible grassroots organizations like Salman's, for example, that are doing incredible work to hold the Iraqi government accountable, the international community accountable, and do the work of cleaning up from and restoring the violence that we saw in Iraq over the last 20/50 years. So I think looking to the grassroots leaders who are doing this work is one way to avoid that domineering form of intervention we see so commonly.
I'd like to jump in here and talk about the need for self-education, because when we talk about help for the Iraqis, you know, I think that everyone has to recognize their strengths, but also the limitations of their positionality. So an American can do very little to change the the situation on the ground as it is, but he can do, or she can do a lot to educate her or himself. And it's about seeking out information from a wide and diverse range of sources, and also to just challenge the biases that we all have, and to engage in conversations as stimulating as the one that we're having, and just to speak to Iraqis and not to be afraid to do so, and I think that, yeah, I'd like to sort of underline accountability. So to carry on from what Kali is saying, you know, we can't arrive at accountability without pressurizing our governments. So regardless of whether we're in America or in the UK or in any other European country, I think that we can carry out our civic duty and to demand accountability and transparency regarding not just 2003, sort of this watershed moment, but the events that it set in motion. So yeah, I would urge people to learn about how their governments are still involved in Iraq and how they're fueling various injuries against the country and its people.
Go ahead, Salman.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. Yeah, thank you for Kali and Nazli. I just want to add one point also above that. It's about solidarity, as you mentioned. Showing solidarity is one of the main points that we need. It's in that time until now, what we need is showing solidarity in many ways. And unfortunately, the international media agencies, they didn't bring the reality and the best picture of what's going on exactly in Iraq to the all international people to know what's going on in Iraq. Still, there is people, they thought like there is, okay, like there is people work as Kali mentioned, there is people working now as a grassroots organization. There is a civil society movement also in Iraq. Some of them, they got threat, and some of them, they still working under the threat. And that's two kind of people, they both need showing solidarity. Each one, he can do his best from his position. Sometimes I know that the local communities all around the world, maybe the only one thing that they can do it's showing solidarity on social media. When something happens, showing solidarity on media, on any, doing my best from the way that I can do. This is the most important point for us. Thank you.
If I could answer that just briefly too. Yeah, I would just say, again, I think the best thing we can do in the US is to reflect and to undertake that kind of atonement that I was speaking about. What happened to Iraq was a terrible crime, one of the worst crimes imaginable, the crime of aggression. It is not a light thing that happened 20 years ago. And I think what we need to be doing urgently in the United States is reflecting and doing that deep work. You know, just as it's a deep and painful process to do that kind of personal atonement, you know, for a crime you may have committed. We have to do that collective work and to do that collective atonement for the crime that was committed collectively in the name of the United States and the people of the United States. That's the type of work that needs to happen immediately, or something like Iraq will happen again.
Any other thoughts to add on that? Well, this next question is for Dave Inder from Professor Jim Hicks, asking, do you think the ICC charges against Putin for his war of aggression would make it more likely that similar standards will be applied to the very similar aggression of 2 decades ago? That's it.
It's a very good question. It's just been a few days, I think, since that indictment was announced. I think I'm still personally digesting it myself, because there are a lot of good reasons to support that indictment. There are a lot of not so good reasons to support that indictment. I think we need accountability for all leaders who commit aggression, wherever they come from. My only concern, or my initial concern, is that the United States is not a supporter of the ICC and has not stated that it itself would hold itself to that standard. And my concern would be a weaponization of the international rule of law, or a kind of lawfare used by the United States and its allies in the conflict with, in Russia against other people around the world. And I think that that kind of double standard is very obvious to a lot of people who are neutral in the conflict. A lot of people, a lot of scholars in Latin America or Africa or Asia who have, for whatever reason, have not chosen expressly to take a side, or who are acting in a more diplomatic way. I think that double standard is very obvious to them. I support any neutral legal procedure against any leader for committing aggression.
Thank you. This next question is directed at Nazli, but Salman might also have feelings about this. The question is how most Iraqis felt and responded to the looting at the time.
The events that I discussed have been greatly condemned and lamented by Iraqis at large, but also it strikes me as very short-sighted that the Americans and the Brits, didn't see this coming. I think that it was inevitable, knowing the lid that they were removing. So that was a really impoverished society that had to endure vicious sanctions that created needs and wants, and so when the Americans came in, it was this opportunity, this long-awaited opportunity for people to just sort of restock their home with furniture, restock their shelves with food. In not all cases was it pernicious, but the event that I discussed, that was a targeted event, and it was planned for. They went in a beeline for certain institutions, but it's not a proud moment in Iraqi history or public memory, and it's not something that we think of fondly, and the images are really scarring, I would say, because it's the depiction of Iraqi society, and that becomes magnified, and then these people become sort of the face of a society that has, for the best part of 3 decades, despite the recurrent wars that it was subjected to, had lived quite nobly, and never has felt the need to steal. So there is this Iraqi pride that it verges on sort of denial that no, this is not happening, it couldn't have happened, and I think that also the way that it was covered has contributed to the fragmentation of Iraqi society, and I would say the reimposition of certain class positions. So it's like, oh, it's the low classes that engage in behavior like this, and the middle classes would never dream of sort of looting the contents of their grandparents' home. The event was could be seen as analogous to that, but it's really distressing and upsetting even 20 years on, because you feel for the people who are stealing, and at the same time you want to rue them for engaging in it, and it becomes sort of this mass hysteria, and it just snowballs and snowballs, and I think that is what happened, and I think that the Americans were in a position to help, and they chose not to.
Yes, thank you, Nazli. I want also to add on that. It's actually basically what's happened at that time. I have seen once what's going on in my eye directly, but I saw a lot of videos at that time about what's going on, and what I hear, and all the information in that time, what's happened or from the looting, it was only for the like the government agencies, the building who's related to the Al-Ba'ath party or the ministry or part of the government in that time. It didn't happen to my brother's shop. No one opened the look or taken something from the shop. So the people, they were focusing on something like, I don't want to give them an excuse, but the people in that time who doesn't have a piece of bread to eat, and he is extremely poor. He just needs something to get from this life. So what he's just, when he saw the army, they opened the gate of the palace for him, which is Saddam has more than 5 palaces, maybe in Baghdad, and in each city there is palaces for Saddam Hussein, and the soldier, they just opened the door and they told the people, yeah, come in and get whatever you want. So in that time, the people, they start, because of it's the invitation itself. It's also a bad thing what's happened from the army themselves. And I think the army, they know and they mean what they did when they open the gates and they tell the people, yeah, get whatever you want. And the people, they start to get the fan, they get the sofa, they get the bed, they get the chairs, everything to put it in their house. I swear there is a lot of people right now, they are feeling shame about what's happened in that time, because it's not worthy, it's not worth enough to what they get. They thought at that time it's something big that they get, but it's not that worth from all what we lost till now. Thank you.
Can I also just chime in? So to bring it back to the footage, because there's a huge volume of documentation of those days, and you can hear voices in the background. They don't necessarily feature in the films. You know, there are no faces, but you can certainly hear whispers in the background of people saying, you know, how is it that you can do this? Do you have a heart? Do you have a moral compass? And so there was opposition. People didn't stand in the way of looters, and they didn't sort of try and reclaim what they were taking. But not everybody was of the view that that they're entitled to state property because of the precedent that sets. And I think that that's what we were beginning to see, sort of, again, like not just the disfiguration of the landscape in the way that the Kali is discussed, or the disfiguration of you know, the natural ecology of archives, but of Iraq, of the Iraqi character. You know, it was, you know, if it was sending the message that this is allowed and this is appropriate, and so it just sets a new norm and a new standard that definitely we didn't see prior to 2003, because there would have been repercussions.
Thank you for that. So our next question is from Robin in the audience. Robin wants to know if the invasion impacted Iraqis differently based on gender. If so, how?
Iraq had one of the highest female literacy rates in the Middle East, and now it's one of the lowest. There are a lot of reasons for that, of course, but there's a great joke that many Iraqis that I spend time with tell, which is that Laura Bush goes to Afghanistan and she sees a woman in full niqab with her head down, walking 10 feet behind her husband. And Laura Bush says, this is terrible. I'm going to fix Afghanistan and make it a feminist state. And so she spends 20 years and she fixes Afghanistan. And she goes back to, I don't know, Kabul, and she sees the same woman, the same Afghan woman walking with her head down, 10 feet behind her husband. And she says, what happened? I thought I fixed it. And the woman looks at her and says, landmines. The kind of security threats that were unleashed to everyday life and the people that lived in these contexts meant that gender disparity was compounded, because in some cases it was essential to survival. Of the families that I've interviewed, and I'm asking people about their exposure histories, their exposure to bombs going off and to gunfire, how many times they've handled dead bodies, men often have 5, 10, 15 stories. And many of the women, especially younger women, have none. So it's not just an issue of the kind of policy and destruction that produces gender inequality in the ways we expect, but also that oftentimes when people's lives and livelihoods are under threat, hierarchy is one of the quickest ways to keep people's bodies alive. So there is a lot going on. Perhaps others can speak to it more.
I wanted to come in and just reinforce some of these points. So I would say that we've seen sort of femicides on the rise, illiteracy on the rise, domestic violence on the rise. I'll give sort of a harrowing example. So you're dealing with a country in which shelters for women fleeing domestic violence are criminalized. And I think that that in itself speaks volumes to the place of Iraqi women in post-2003 Iraq. And we're seeing almost what I would describe as sort of like the ruralization of the Iraqi woman, that like your place is at home to bear children, to farm, possibly to punt in the marshes. It's not in schools, it's not behind a desk. And also we see that in the way that religious norms are also imposed on women, and the way that women are expected to uphold certain standards, especially when it comes to dress and speech and just general etiquette. And it's devastating, because if you look back to the 80s, I think that was a really formative period for womanhood and motherhood, because a lot of women were left without men, and a lot of families became they lost the head of the household, so the patriarch. So who becomes the new patriarch? It's women. And during that period, women, they did thrive, but out of necessity, if you like. So Iraq has been hurtling backwards and at a very rapid rate. I think that's also visible in video footage to bring it back to sort of my craft. You don't see very many women in public spaces. Yes.
May I jump in? And quick sentences. Yeah, sorry. I just want to go further deep to the south part of Iraq, which is the Iraqi marshes. In the 8th of March, all the Iraqis, they will celebrate also in the Women Global, the International Day of Women's, and they say Happy Women's Day, and no one think about the Arab March. What's going on to those native population that we have it in the deep of the marshes, which is the women during Saddam time. And nowadays, they are facing the same pressure and maybe more and more. In the beginning, during Saddam time, it might be because only there is no water. Now, because there is no water and there is no food, and even if they want to immigrate to another place, there is no other city accepting Arab March now in Iraq. So just imagine, I think from my perspective is the women and girls after the war, they get more pressure on them. Maybe the culture was hiding them before 2003. But when the culture was open after 2003, the pressure was more and more on women. The women now in Iraq, they are fighting for their rights, of course, and there is a lot of feminism movement in Iraq, and they are success. And I'm happy, I'm proud of all my colleagues and all the girls that they are fighting for their rights, and also I'm fighting with them for their rights. But what's happened in this date, like before 2003 and after, it might be make the situation worse, because it didn't get, if you want to change the culture, you cannot change it like that. It's need a work, and it's need a lot like duration. It's need a long period to change it. You cannot change it as Kali mentioned when he went to Afghanistan and he want to change it in one day. No one can change it in one day. Thank you so much.
Can I just add a really quick point? Just to, I guess, help audiences understand just how bad a place Iraq is for women. These retrograde attitudes to female rights perforate various classes. So it's not just sort of the uneducated or sort of impoverished classes that think in this way. So I was watching an interesting TV report by a Western outlet about women's place in the party scene, so the party industry. And for instance, the women often would have pushback from males, often querying, well, why is it that you're here? And this is that attitude is really, it's coming from really educated, the most educated classes in Iraq. So it's frightening, and it's dangerous, because if the people who should inspire hope no longer inspire hope, then how can we fix this topsy-turvy situation? And I think what's more dangerous as well is collusive behavior between Western governments and also governmental institutions, and a government that it masquerades as a liberal democracy, when in actual fact it functions like a theocracy. And these commandments, to keep women in their place and at home, and in other in other restrictive spaces, it's coming from sort of the center, and then it's sort of proliferating outwards, and so Western governments should think better about their alliance, and the way that they also approach the question of women's rights. It seems to be bottom of their agenda, frankly speaking.
I'd like to build off of this question, but bring it back to the environment. Hasn't the environmental impact of the war also had a gendered impact? I'm thinking specifically about the crisis of birth defects, if anyone can speak to that.
Carla, please go ahead if you want to cover, and I will continue.
Sure. Of the many families that I interviewed in a case control study on the rate of birth defects in Fallujah, part of the question is not just what is causing a higher rate of congenital anomalies, but also what are the psychosocial costs that women are facing when either they or their family members are experiencing reproductive health issues. Generally, especially in poorer communities, infertility is associated with men, and poor birth outcomes are associated with women. So when children are born with severe permanent disabilities or don't survive, women are often blamed for that, which includes things like jokes that aren't really jokes about taking on second wives or replacing women with other women, which is a more common form. But then there are also policy level issues. For example, women who have more than one child with a severe permanent disability don't have any public infrastructure, and they're incredibly isolated. So it's not exactly like there's a co-op of women who are coordinating to manage care. There's a lot of isolation associated with the long-term, lifelong consequences. But finally, there's a lot of fear and stigma. So in some cases, if a woman has a child with a birth defect, her sister won't be able to marry, or women are being told not to conceive because they've given birth so many times. Women are also facing extreme obstetric risks because hospitals are under-equipped. A lot of women I talked to discussed the fear of moving from the labor section of the hospital to the delivery section of the hospital, because it's such a bumpy path between the two that some women are facing lower level spinal injury in the process of just giving birth. And even more, a lot of women are having trouble because they have children, and by the 4th month of gestation, they're finding out they have a child that will not survive. Many are trying to get late-term abortion because they don't want to go through the process of carrying a child to term and delivering a dead baby. It's an incredibly traumatic experience, and women are having to go through this process again and again. So that's just a small portrait of the kind of costs women are facing disproportionately.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. Thanks, Kali. I just want to add also about in Basra. She's bringing something from Anbar, and I want to bring something from Basra. In Basra, actually, there is much more and a lot of like blood diseases between the families there, and a child especially, and they have a special hospital for that. But and this special hospital is not enough for only Basra itself for the blood diseases, child and adult and all of them together. Now there is a lot of family that I know from Basra. They do have a new child with those blood diseases. They start to say, no, we don't want to do any child anymore. They start to afraid to create any more child because of what's going on from all the blood diseases that we have there. And still there is a lot of story, like all what we have, unfortunately, all what we have, it's based on our recording, because the Iraqi government, they didn't allow us to get any documentation or archiving or numbers or any statistics about what's going on from all the diseases and what's going on in Basra. Only what we need to know, because of the oil invasion, because of the chemical weapon it was used in Al-Faw before, and all the war from Saddam time, from the Iraqi-Iranian war till now, it's Basra, the main city, affected by that. And all of this, it's doing something, they call it bioaccumulation. And this bioaccumulation, is still affecting not only the human being, the animals start to affect now. And even the taste of the fish start to change, like oily. The taste of the fish now, they start to be oily. Just imagine that. So if you will get one fish, you didn't taste that. But if you will get more than two, the bioaccumulation will start now in your body, and you will realize like there is something error. There is something wrong. It's going on in your body. And not only with the fish, even if you want to back to the cow and water buffaloes, all this are affected by what's going on in the marshes. This is deep in the south. If you want to go upstream a little bit, you will see the plant, how is it polluted and contaminated, especially in Salah ad-Din and Mosul, and all the war and what's happened with Daesh, which means ISIS, which we didn't call them ISIS, we call them Daesh. So during Daesh time and what's going on in this area, which is still as an army based for the people, and because of all the militias still controlling this area, and they use this area as an army based, and still the family around, they are facing the same terrible things.
If possible, could I just also, sticking with this theme, ask Callie sort of two related questions? So for women who are giving birth to children with congenital defects, does the burden of childcare fall on them? Because I assume that the father is out sort of, working and making sure that the family has a roof over their heads. And the other thing is about societal attitudes. How are these women viewed at large? Because I know that Fallujah is a very conservative society, and often sort of you have these ideas, rightly or wrongly, that someone has harmed another person and therefore this is God's wrath. And do you still have aspects of that, or is the sheer brutality of sort of the violence as a result of the US occupation sort of forcing people to change their attitudes and actually show these women empathy, or anything else?
It's the latter, and that's partly because of campaigns by doctors like Dr. Samira in Fallujah, but also, when I ask families during my interviews with them, and this is like, maybe 250 people in total, and I ask people what they think the cause of their child's congenital anomaly is, or what they think the cause of other people's congenital anomalies are. The men tend to answer it's from war and it's from chemical exposure. And it's women who tend to answer that it's either God's will, or they blame themselves for certain steps they might have taken, like perhaps the use of birth control, or perhaps a medical intervention, or the use of makeup. And so they're looking for a much broader range of answers. So, but I do think that there is a widely held understanding that congenital anomalies are linked with environmental exposures. And people are really just trying to find a way to have good healthy reproductive lives. And a lot of families are making decisions together about whether or not to have children with more equity than we might expect. That said, women are left with an incredibly difficult caretaking burden because even children who have simple physical disabilities like the inability to walk are deemed unfit for the public education system, not because of cruelty, but because it's simply impossible to provide that kind of care and service. And so they're left at home and they're either homeschooled or they're not schooled at all. So this is really a caretaking crisis, and women are incredibly isolated in that task.
Incredible. Well, we're running out of time, so I think we'll ask one more question. This is building off of Callie's presentation about war medals, but it's directed towards everyone. Are there any legal protections against the destruction of the environment? And are there examples of mutual solidarity movements or action networks between Iraqis and people living in other sites of US imperialism, such as Puerto Rico, Honduras, Vietnam, and others?
Yeah, I can address the legal protections. There is a growing, three things I would say. One is there is a movement to criminalize ecocide, which is happening in a variety of different countries. There's an international proposed law that would ban the widespread or severe destruction of the environment. It's a law that I don't think has yet to be passed in any jurisdiction, but there is a lively and ongoing and growing movement to criminalize conduct that would do that. The second is that there's also a growing movement to related to the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and that the UN General Assembly just affirmed that principle. The Human Rights Council also recently affirmed that human right. That's a recognized now human right that might give lawyers and jurisdictions some claim with respect to that. But yeah, I would say, and then I think in Latin America in particular, there's also a growing acknowledgement of the need to bring our societies back into homeostasis with natural systems. So in Chile, there is an ongoing procedure and process to reform their constitution. And in the September 2022 draft constitution that was rejected, there was a draft article that would have required the state to maintain homeostasis with natural systems. It's actually a very brilliant concept that you see a couple places in Latin America in particular. So yes, there are things that can be done legally. It's just time to implement them.
So the rest of the question was asking about mutual solidarity movements and action networks between Iraqis and other sites of US imperialism.
Yeah, may I add here? Yes, for us, especially in Humad Dijla and Save Tigris in general, because yeah, Humad Dijla and Save the Tigris is not the same. Humad Dijla, it's working in the local level of only Iraq, and Save the Tigris working in region level, which is Mesopotamian level, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey, and Kurdistan in between. So we have this partnership with an organization based in US called Enabling Peace.org that you can, I share already with you, Rose, their website that you can share it in the chat later. And also we have this solidarity from there is a movement in US also called 11 September, something like that, which is the families who's affected by the attack in that time. In US, they shown solidarity through an umbrella also supporting Iraqi civil society called ICSSI, which is Iraqi Civil Society Solidarity Initiative. And this initiative also supporting Iraqi civil society through collecting international voices with solidarity, donation, and other humanitarian and development work that we have done in Iraq. Especially also there is a path related to the environment, there is a path on worker rights, there is a path on women rights. So there is and there is a path on shrinking spaces, especially this is creating right now because the Iraqi government, they started shrinking the work of the civil society. So we started this new campaign about shrinking spaces. And also there is a path about women's rights, worker rights, freedom of expression. So they covering more than one path. And also in the end, there is a special campaign to protect the human rights defenders who's in the front line. So all this also is as a part of our work and what the collaboration and the partnership between the people in US and Europe and also in Iraq together.
Any other concluding thoughts from our speakers?
I would just say that Iraq is rich enough for the government to be able to sort of mitigate some of these effects, but I think that in terms of its policy position, it chooses to stand by. So, and if anything, I would say that also certain industries are major contributors to that pollution. Construction, for instance, is one of them, but it's just that there are so many problems. You know, there's so many entangled issues, and I don't think that the government has shown that it has an appetite to fix environmental issues. It could be that they really don't believe in in climate change, but it could partly be that, but it's also that this is a costly endeavor. You know, why should we build solar powered homes when we can trouser that money?
Well, I wish we could keep going, but unfortunately we do have to conclude. So I would like to thank the audience for all of their questions and thank our speakers for their amazing presentations and comments. I'm really glad that we were able to make the 20th anniversary of these tragic events an occasion for learning. And I just hope that we can channel some of this energy into action. So before we go, I just want to alert some of you to some of the organizations that were mentioned during these presentations that are doing great work. So at UMass, there is a chapter, UMass Dissenters, which is a student-led group fighting to demilitarize UMass. You can follow them on Instagram at UMass Dissenters. So Salman's organization, Hamat Dijla, is an NGO doing important environmental stewardship work along the Tigris River. Also, he mentioned the Iraqi Civil Society Initiative. It's a coalition of Iraqi unions, professional associations, NGOs, and grassroots organizations working for peace and justice. There is Bridge Iraq, which is a terrific NGO providing humanitarian aid to Iraqi communities. Callie, Nazli, and myself are involved with Archive Iraq, which will be an open access digital repository of primary and secondary sources of Iraqi history. This is a project in the works, but we will be releasing our collection soon. So please stay tuned for that and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and our website is archiveiraq.org. And links to these organizations will be provided in the chat and also a resources document that will be shared with everyone. Nazli is also creating a repository of Iraqi audio video files and an inventory of popular television programs. So you can follow this ongoing project at her Twitter handle, Nazli Tarzi. And I believe that is it. But as I said, the links and documents will be forthcoming. So thank you all so much. We're going to have to sign off now. But let's keep the conversation going and continue to push for a more informed memory of Iraq and accountability for the architects of this invasion and occupation. Thank you all so much.